So, hello and welcome to episode 10 of CCLG's Research Talks for Parents and Public. I am Ellie Ellicott, and my job is to share research with our supporters. So, starting with some housekeeping, we'll be holding a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So please do submit your questions whenever you think of one using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to use the chat function, please make sure you set the to drop down to everyone, or people may not see your message. The webinar is being recorded and will be available publicly on our YouTube channel next week, and we will send out a link when it's ready to watch. So this month's talk is called How Can Leukemia Treatment Affect a Child's Brain? And is being led by Professor Chris Halsey. Chris is the head of the School of Cancer Sciences at the University of Glasgow and treats children with leukemia at the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow. In her research, she focuses on the central nervous system directed treatment of leukemia in the hopes of making these treatments safer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Ellie. So I'll just share my screen. So let me just check. I've got 3 screens, which always makes it challenging. I think you should be able to see my slides there, and they should be in the correct format, yes?
Yep, all good.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this webinar and hearing a little bit more about leukemia treatment and its effect on the brain. I've just as you see, my title is just slightly different in that when I came to putting this talk together, I thought it would be really nice, because this is a research seminar series, to really talk about the research we're doing here in our lab in Glasgow about how we might actually reduce brain side effects of leukemia treatment. But what I'll be doing is taking you through everything we know about how leukemia, not everything, but some things we know, some highlights about what we know about how leukemia affects the brain, and really take a positive approach about what we're trying to do to improve this for children now and in the future. So as Ellie said, I'm the Professor of Pediatric Hemato-Oncology. I'm head of the School of Cancer Sciences, and I'm a clinical academic. So that means that I am a doctor who treats children in the Royal Hospital for Children, and that is, I'll just get my pointer. Here it is, the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow, a nice new hospital. And I treat children with leukemia there, but just usually about 1 day a week, and 4 days a week I'm in my research labs here in the Wilson World Cancer Research Centre with a fantastic team of researchers. And this is just some of them. We have about 10 researchers in our group at the moment. And we work on all things related to brain leukemia. So why are we interested in brain leukemia? So most of you will be aware that leukemia actually starts in the bone marrow, and many people might not actually be aware at all that leukemia affects the brain. So I always think of the bone marrow as a little bit like the factory that makes your blood cells. So this marrow sits within the bones in the body, and we have these things called blood stem cells in the bone marrow that divide and produce all the different types of blood cells that you need to keep healthy, like white blood cells to fight infections, red blood cells to carry oxygen around the body, and platelets to help with your blood clotting. But when leukemia develops, what happens is that some of these white blood cells, and particularly in the case of ALL, the lymphocytes, start dividing uncontrollably, and they take over the function of the bone marrow. They stop the bone marrow producing the other healthy red blood cells and other blood cells, and they just fill up the bone marrow. But also, because normal white blood cells and the blood normally circulates around the body, they also leave the bone marrow and enter the circulation to move around the body of the patient. And so this is really quite different from how we might think about solid cancers like breast cancer or bowel cancer, where the cancer starts in one organ, the bowel or the breast, and what it does first, it just makes a bigger and bigger lump in that organ, and then at later stages of the disease, it may leave that organ, circulate around in the blood and go to other places, and that's a process we call metastasis. Now, in blood cancers, because leukemia is a cancer of the blood, kind of by definition, the disease has moved all around the body by the time that the child presents, or the adult. And we kind of know that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because this transformation of a blood cell into a bad blood cell that's caused cancer must have happened in one place in the bone marrow, maybe in your thigh bone or in your arm bone or in your skull or something like that. But by the time a child presents, we can do a bone marrow test from the hip bone, and we always find the leukemia there. So it must have left where it started and then gone all the way around the body and ended up just around all the bone marrow. And similarly, we know if we look by scanning and things that quite often when a child presents with leukemia, they can have leukemia in their kidneys and in their liver and in their spleen, and also in their brain. And that is the focus of the topic today. So actually, we know that to cure leukemia, you need to treat these cells that have moved around the blood cell system and are now hiding in the brain. And actually, luckily for us in some ways, they don't actually get right into the substance of the brain. So they tend to sit in this fluid that sits around the outside of the brain. And this fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, or we usually call it CSF. And this is where the leukemia cells hide away from the chemo and can settle in this area. Now, this is the same area that normal white blood cells might go into to see whether there's any evidence of infection in the brain and leave again. Normal white blood cells don't normally go into the substance of the brain, what we call the white matter and the grey matter, because you wouldn't really want inflammation and things going on in your brain. So they go into this fluid around the brain, see if there's any trouble, and if there isn't any trouble, they leave, but the leukemia cells go in and they can stay there. Now, brain leukemia presents us a particular problem because actually the brain is very protected from anything that might be harmful to it that's circulating in the bloodstream. So there's a thing called the blood-brain barrier, which protects the brain from damage. And I always think of this a little bit like a water filter. So essentially you've got the blood at the top, and then there's a kind of filter to allow the good things to pass through into the cerebrospinal fluid, but not necessarily the bad things. And this is a kind of barrier. And this is really useful if you get an infection, you don't want it to pass over into your brain. If you get, you have something in the bloodstream that's toxic to the brain, it can't get through. But obviously it's not useful when we're trying to give drugs to kill leukemia cells. And so many of you have had friends or family treated for leukemia will know that part of childhood leukemia treatment is to give what we call intrathecal therapy. This is the lumbar puncture or the spinal tap, where we often put kids to sleep, and we actually put a needle directly into this fluid around the brain, and we do it down at this lumbar region in the spine, which then the fluid is connected to all this system around the brain. And we actually inject the chemotherapy directly into that fluid, and that allows us to bypass this normal barrier. And we do that for all children with leukemia, not just children where they might have symptoms of having brain leukemia. And the reason we do that is this. So many of you who've been to these seminars might even have seen this curve before, but this is what we call a survival curve. So this is a child presenting with leukemia, and right at the beginning, 100% of the patients are alive. And then this on the other axis is the time since they were diagnosed. 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years. And you can see nowadays, if you follow your line, there's a child who's diagnosed with leukemia now. This is actually even 10 years out of date, but it's roughly the same. They will follow this line, so that after 6 years, over 95% of them will still be alive, which is fantastic. However, you can see back in the 1960s, although some of them would survive, 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, actually only about 1 in 10 children actually survived long-term from their leukemia treatment. Got a little bit better in the 1970s when we added in some extra drugs, but there was this huge jump between 1970 and 1972, and this came with the recognition that we needed to treat the CNS in all children. So what was happening here is that many children were initially going into remission, but then later on the disease would come back, and it often came back in the fluid around the brain. So the researchers said, look, even though we can't see the leukemia there, clearly it's a problem, let's start treating it. And they added in this CNS-directed therapy to all children. They did do some other tweaks as well, but this was one of the main reasons why we got this huge uptick in leukemia survival. So we used to use radiotherapy to do this, so X-ray treatment to the brain and the spinal cord. But although that is quite successful, it caused a lot of side effects to children and whose brains are still developing and shining X-rays and damaging the DNA in these in the normal brain cells could cause a lot of side effects long term. So we switched more recently to other treatments that we use to treat brain leukemia, and these are chemotherapy based. So I've already talked about the injections that we can do directly into the spinal cord, and this is the mainstay. This is mostly how we treat CNS leukemia, but we also know that some of the drugs that we give by mouth or into the bloodstream can cross that blood-brain barrier and get into the spinal fluid. So dexamethasone, one of the steroid medicines, can get through quite effectively into the brain. And if we give methotrexate in very high dose into a vein, it can also cross. And these treatments are really good, as I showed you, of getting rid of CNS leukemia, so the leukemia cells in the brain. But unfortunately, because they're treatments that basically affect dividing cells, particularly the methotrexate, they can also do damage to other dividing cells in the brain, such as the neurons, the brain cells themselves, and cause brain-related side effects. So this treatment can cause side effects that are either acute, like during the treatment, or longer term. And again, anyone who has had a child or a friend or family member going through leukemia treatment will be very familiar with the types of side effects that we see with things like steroid treatment. So this is, I think, a poem that was written by an older sibling of a child going through leukemia treatment, and just is so evocative. And many of you will chime a lot of chime with a lot of you. So this is about his younger brother who was on treatment. He collects loads of chocolate, 1,000 shouts and screams, lots of pots of noodles, 1 billion toys, several packets of quavers, only one film, and oh, the moans. And this is very typical of the kind of thing we can see with children on steroid treatment. Luckily, when you stop the steroid treatment, this usually reverts back to normal. This is an effect of the steroids on the brain. But we know our other leukemia treatments, the methotrexate that I mentioned, and other agents can also cause brain side effects suddenly during treatment. So we can sometimes see things like children have fits or seizures, a thing called stroke-like syndrome, which looks like a stroke but gets better itself, or problems with confusion, and even sometimes, very rarely, comas and things like that on treatment. But we also know that leukemia treatment in some children can have longer term effects. And the kind of common things that we see are problems with things like processing speed. So that's thinking quickly and on your feet and doing tasks very rapidly. We also know that they can have problems with attention, and sometimes that can be mild, and sometimes that can be a kind of full-blown attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, that you've probably heard so much about. And that seems to be commoner in children who've received leukemia treatment than the general population, although it is quite common also in the general population. And lots of studies over the years have shown that, in particular, the types of things that are affected by ALL treatment, the methotrexate, etc., are what we call executive function skills. And you could ask, what are executive function skills? And this is a nice infographic showing some of the things that this involves. So, and again, some of you may recognize these kind of problems that can be quite subtle. So problems with time management, problems with what we call flexibility. That's not actually flexibility of the body, that's the ability of your brain to modify and adapt to changing situations, the ability to organize and manage things, the ability to start tasks and stop them properly, your working memory, so that's using your short-term memory to complete tasks, such as you might need that in a game of chess, for example, your self-control, so your ability to stop and think before acting, and your emotional control, which is the ability to manage your feelings. So all of these can impact on children, both at school in terms of paying attention in class and completing tasks, but also just in everyday life. So if you think about something as simple as when you grow up wanting to cook an evening meal, you need to decide what you're going to eat, you need to go to the shops, you need to buy the right thing, you need to come home. Maybe when you get to the shops, the one ingredient's missing and you need to think about a different ingredient or change your plans, and then you need to get home and then you need to cook the meal. These are all things that use a lot of these executive functioning tasks. But I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. And one of the really puzzling things about brain side effects is that not everyone seems to be affected equally. So although we can have children who've had identical treatment, we can see very big differences in how their brain is affected. So we think somewhere between 20 and 40% of children have some of these longer term effects from leukemia treatment, although, as I mentioned, they can be quite subtle. But there are other children whose sail through treatment, sail through long term. We have many, many people who had leukemia treatment who are doctors, lawyers, professors, business leaders, etc. So it's not an inevitable thing from leukemia treatment. And the other thing that makes it a little bit difficult for us is that actually these types of problems, so ADHD, but also other kind of mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, etc., are really common in the general population. And so sometimes it's really difficult to know whether it was the leukemia treatment that caused it or whether it might have happened anyway. So this is a statistic from the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. One in 4 females aged 17 to 19 had a mental health condition back in 2017, and this is continuously on the rise. So sometimes it's really difficult to know whether it was leukemia treatment or whether this is just bad luck, if you like. So what are we going to do about it? What do we do about this this troubling problem from leukemia treatment? So we cure our children with leukemia. We want them to have a full, happy life, live till their parents, grandparents, through to their 70s and 80s. And we obviously don't want any of our treatments to have late effects on the body. And so I think what we're really looking for here is a kind of Goldilocks point. So if we give too little CNS-directed therapy, that brain-directed chemotherapy, so our porridge is too cold, we're going to get the leukemia coming back in the brain. If we give too much, so our porridge is too hot, we're going to get the side effects. Okay, the leukemia is not going to come back, but we're going to get the side effects. What we want to do is find this perfect point for each child, this just right point, which is enough to make the leukemia go away, but not too much to cause side effects. And at the moment, we have real difficulties with doing that for a number of reasons that I'm going to talk about our research and the kind of things we're trying to overcome so that we can reach this Goldilocks point for each child. So I've already mentioned the current CNS-directed treatments we give. And our first problem is that we're really in the dark about how much treatment each child needs. So we have some very crude ways of identifying leukemia in the brain. We take some spinal fluid and we look for it under the microscope. But we can only see it under the microscope in about 3% of children. And yet we know if we don't treat, it'll come back in about 70% of children. So we're missing a huge amount of patients that need treatment, but we can't see the leukemia, so we don't know how much to give. And we may be missing a very small number of patients, probably very small, that actually don't need the treatment or they need a tiny, tiny amount. And because we can't see it, we're essentially treating with a blindfold on. We can't work out how much to give children and when to stop and when's enough. And many people who've been through leukemia treatment in their family or with a family member or friend will know that in the bone marrow, we do adapt the treatment according to how well it's responding to treatment. That's called measurable residual disease, or MRD. And we use that to make give each other the right, correct amount of treatment. But we can't do that for the CNS. So even low-risk MRD patients get a lot of CNS-directed therapy. So research project number 1 is to try and identify better tests and not rely on the microscope, which just isn't good enough, isn't sensitive enough, and look sub-microscopic levels for evidence of CNS leukemia to see if we can use this to adjust the patient's treatment according to how well they're responding. And so we have a really interesting and very exciting research study as part of the Altogether trial, which is the current leukemia trial across Western Europe that the UK participates in. And our team in Glasgow are running this study called CSF Flow, where we're taking some of the spinal fluid at the time the child gets their intrathecal therapy, their lumbar puncture. We take a little bit of the spinal fluid, and then we use all these really sophisticated tests that are kind of really sensitive and submicroscopic to see if we can detect the leukemia and see how it's responding to treatment. Now, that research project's ongoing. It's funded by the Little Princess Trust, and it will be, the results will probably be available in a few, maybe 2, 3, 4 years' time. But we've already got nearly 2,000 children participating in this study, so we're really hopeful that we're going to have some answers about better ways of risk stratifying patients. If we can risk stratify patients, that means that hopefully for many patients we can give them less CNS-directed therapy, less of the methotrexate, etc., which means that they should have less side effects. But just giving less of something something that still kills brain cells to a certain extent or affects brain cells is still not really good enough. So I always think, particularly with the radiotherapy we used to do, this is a little bit like what we do to the CNS. We kind of blast it, without kind of really knowing what we're really aiming for, and that it has kind of side effects and collateral damage from this kind of blasting of the leukemic cells in the brain, certainly in some patients. So the other big thing that we're doing in our research lab is really trying to develop new treatments for brain leukemia with less side effects. So we started off just with a blank page, basically, because people knew very little about, cells in the brain, how they were different or the same as cells in the bone marrow. And one of the things that people always used to say about brain leukemia is that, they survive in the brain because it's what we call a sanctuary site. And that's somewhere where leukemic cells can hide away from the treatment that we're giving to try and kill them. So that's because of the blood-brain barrier, the water filter that I showed you. We give the treatment, doesn't get in there. So, and we also know that the normal immune system cells don't get in there to mop up any cells that are left over after treatment. So yeah, I think it's true that the CNS is a bit of a sanctuary site. But actually, this is what I think of when I think of a sanctuary, or think nice little spa day. But actually, the CNS is nothing like this. So that cerebrospinal fluid that I showed you is much more like a barren desert. So it's really low in nutrients and all the things that cells need to survive compared to the bloodstream. So these are just some technical things, but it's got very low levels of sugars, of proteins, of lipids. It's also got low levels of oxygen compared to the bloodstream. So this might give us some clues as to how to kill the cells in this environment. So if you think of the desert and how things survive in the desert, we know that some animals, like camels, for example, are genetically adapted to live in the desert. They like living there. And we certainly know that there are some types of leukemia, some genetic mutations that are more likely to cause CNS relapses, probably because those genes have adapted the cells to that new environment. But actually, even low-risk leukemias with low-risk genetic problems can still relapse in the CNS. And in that case, they're probably being a bit more like chameleons. They're getting into this desert-type environment, and they're kind of changing their color to match that, changing the genes that they express. And then actually, they can go back to the bone marrow and change back again as well. And we have quite a lot of evidence from from our experiments in the lab that that's the case, that they're being very adaptable and flexible. But we hope that if we can understand more about how they're surviving in this desert environment, that we might be able to find things that are specific, like kind of Achilles heels, things that we can really kind of get at them because they're in this harsh environment that might not kill them in another environment like the bone marrow. So, I mean, just as an analogy, if you were in the desert like this and I deprived you of water for even a single day, you would probably die. Whereas if, you're sitting in the UK and I said there's one day where you can't drink, you'd be fine. Similarly, if you didn't put your sunscreen on in February in London, you're not going to come to any harm. But if you didn't have a hat and some sunscreen here, then probably after a day or two, you would similarly be extremely unwell, if not dead from severe heat stroke. So we have a large program of work funded by Cancer Research UK that's really looking at exactly this type of thing. What are the specific vulnerabilities that these cells have when we grow them under conditions that are similar to the CSF, to see if we can discover new drugs that will specifically target those leukemia cells, but leave the normal brain cells untouched. So that's the second research project we work on in our lab. And then I'm going to close off just by talking about the third one, which is more specifically about how, these other projects I've told you about are for the future. We don't know yet what these tests are going to be. We don't know what these new treatments are going to be. We're going to have time to test them, etc. And it's going to take a while to move over to these new treatments. So we're stuck a little bit with the treatments we have at the moment, and particularly this methotrexate, which is the thing that causes most of those longer-term cognitive problems. And so is there a way that we can stop the methotrexate causing these brain side effects without affecting its ability to kill leukemia? So this is the third and last project I'm going to tell you about. And this is like trying to understand why some children get side effects and how to treat or prevent. So I'm going to take you through an analogy. I kind of hope it works. It's tricky to think of a good analogy, but essentially this is how methotrexate works. So methotrexate interferes with some of the materials that are needed to make the building blocks of DNA. So methotrexate stops one of these materials being formed. That material normally combines with another material to make blocks, and then the body uses these blocks to make DNA. And DNA carries all your genetic material, and in order for a cell to make a copy of itself and divide and proliferate and become a cancer cell, it needs to make lots of copies of itself, so it needs to keep replicating its DNA to make a new cell. Then the new cell turns into 2 more cells by replicating its DNA and things. So if you stop it replicating its DNA or starve it of the building blocks it needs, then it can't divide. That means it can't expand, which means it can't cause the cancer. So methotrexate stops one of the building blocks. But because it stopped one of the building blocks, the other building block can build up because it's not being used up to make the DNA bricks, if you like. So stopping methotrexate obviously stops the building blocks, stops DNA, treats the leukemia cell. But this build-up, unfortunately, can then cause to go on to that excess of this other material, in this analogy, the paint, then gets broken down, and the breakdown product of these paints actually acts, we know, on some receptors in the brain. There's a receptor called the NMDA receptor. They also release some other oxygen molecules that can affect the stress on the brain as well. And the reason that we're interested in this is that we think that activation of this receptor is responsible for some, if not all, of the cognitive problems. And actually, you can block activation of this pathway in the brain with a common component of cough mixture. So something that we give to kids anyway. And we know from some, not from my lab, but from other labs, experiments that have been done in the lab using what we call preclinical models, so using mice and rats and things that you can give methotrexate to, and you can see that they have problems with learning and memory. If you give them some cough mixture along with methotrexate, that significantly reduces their problems that we can measure in the lab. However, as we know, children are definitely not mice and rats, and so we really need to look at this in children to see if it is true. So we have a study called the BioCan study, which stands for biomarkers to discover new therapeutic targets for chemotherapy-associated neurotoxicity. You can see why we shortened it. And this study is funded actually by Children with Cancer UK. And what we want to do in this study, and what we have done, is we've used a test called Cogstate, which is a series of kind of card games and maze tests and pairs tests that only takes about 15 to 20 minutes, but allows us to pick up early signs that children are having problems with these tasks I told you about, the executive function, the processing speed, etc. So instead of having to wait for years after the leukemia treatment to see whether these problems emerge, you can pick them up quickly. And at the same time, we're taking the cerebrospinal fluid samples, a bit like we did with the CSF flow, which are being taken anyway as part of treatment because the children are having their chemotherapy injected. And we're going to look for these breakdown products, these ones in particular that act on that receptor, but also any others that we can. And we're also looking at the genes from the children, looking at the DNA to see if we can work out why some children are affected and others aren't, to see whether these breakdown products are higher in the kids that have problems on the test. And if they are, that really gives us a smoking gun, which would then allow us to actually do a trial where we tested giving kids the equivalent of cough mixture. We'd obviously have to check it was safe with all the chemo agents we give, etc. But would allow us to give it alongside to try and block the side effects. And the really beautiful thing about the cough mixture story is that this will block the side effects of methotrexate without stopping the way it kills leukemia cells. So that will carry on, but you've just blocked the kind of waste products that cause the side effects. So we are doing lots of other things in this sphere. So this is a really internationally collaborative space. So We are running an international trial across, well, a study, not a trial, across 23 countries where we're collecting all the children who've had side effects. This is the side effects during treatment and trying to work out why some children get side effects and others don't. We're also carrying on that cog state test and collecting the CSF in our Altogether trial so that we can carry on with the progress we've made with the BioCan study. And we're also currently working with groups across the whole of the world, North America and Europe, to develop some guidelines for which children should be monitored for brain side effects of treatment, when and for how long, and whether there's any evidence about what to do if you do have problems. So this is my very last slide. I thought I should end with just some practical things, because obviously this is a research seminar, but I'm sure many of you will be interested in what you should do if you're worried that your loved one or has any of these problems. So I think the first thing to say is it's important to kind of talk to your medical team. That may be your hospital medical team, or it may actually just be your GP, particularly if that's many, many years after treatment. Talk to them about your concerns, the symptoms, etc., and get some one-to-one advice. For children who are still at school, it's obviously important to talk to school, and if the school are raising concerns about academic performance, etc., to kind of make sure they're aware of the fact that they've had this treatment before and whether there's any additional support that can be put in. In children who are having significant problems, you can sometimes be referred to see a specialist called a neuropsychologist, who can actually do some more sophisticated tests than those basic brain tests that I showed you, the cog state tests, and really try and drill down to where children are having specific problems. And that really helps, because the best thing for this is to really identify where each individual child, young person is having problems, and put in task-orientated solutions. And what I mean by that is you can identify where the problem is. So, actually, this is a problem with working memory, not, you just can't remember things for a long time. Then the solution to that is to write things down. So, some people might be able to go to the shop for dinner without a shopping list, but if you've got a problem with your working memory, you need to write it down and take it with you to the shops. And then the problem's not such a big problem when you get to the shops, because you've got a list there to remind you. People have looked at things like whether general kind of brain training programs, so this is a picture of what's called CogMed, which is a brain training program that's been used for childhood cancer survivors, whether these kind of things help. You can train your brain to be stronger, etc. But actually, unfortunately, they don't tend to show sustained benefits. So what they show usually is that you get better at doing the game, but that you're not better in general life. So we all know, watching our kids on Fortnite or Mario Kart or whatever, they'll get better at doing that, but that doesn't necessarily make them smarter at other things. So really it's about finding where the problems are and then putting in a solution or a remedy to try and stop that being such a problem again. Obviously, if a child has clinical ADHD or depression, etc., then there are treatments available for that. And the good thing is, although I've said we don't know whether the leukemia is the cause or not, actually the treatments are the same. So you shouldn't get too hung up about, is this leukemia related ADHD or is this not? The treatments are the same. So as long as you see a specialist in ADHD, you will be getting the right treatment, and you don't need to modify that treatment for the fact that you've had leukemia in the past. So that's a lot of information, but I'm very, very happy to take any questions if I can. I just want to put the caveat that I am not a neuropsychologist or a neurologist. I am a childhood leukemia doctor. So one of my things when I have patients with very complex problems is to refer them on to other specialists who are specialists in that particular field. So I may not be able to answer everything, but I will try my very best. And I was just going to end by just saying that obviously there's tons of people involved in this kind of work. This is just a list of some of the people we work with across the UK, across Glasgow, across the world in these kind of problems. Our funders, I've highlighted a few as I went along, but there are many more. But I just want to highlight this thing at the bottom, which is most importantly, all the patients and their families who help our research. Some of you may have even been involved in our BioCan study. We couldn't do this without you, and that's a super important thing. So thank you to everyone who helps and supports us in any way. And yeah, I'll stop there. Would you like me to stop sharing, Ellie?
Yes, if that's okay, please.
Yeah.
So Well, firstly, to say that was really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing, and I liked the slight twist to how things are improving as well. I think a lot of people appreciate that. We have got a lot of questions, so I'm not quite sure where to dive in with, but let's go with the very first question we have, which is, what factors raise the possibility that the cancer has broken through the barrier, i.e. reached the brain?
Yeah, a great question. And I'm afraid I don't have all the answers. As I mentioned, your cancer can be a bit like a camel. So there are some cancers that we know the genes that they have, the particular what we call mutations, make them more suited to surviving in the brain. But actually, we think that probably, like I said at the beginning, the cancer has spread around the bloodstream. Probably pretty much every child has at least some cancer in the brain at the beginning. You just can't see it. And we know that from lots of bits of evidence collected over the years. And that kind of first observation that if you don't treat the brain, then it will come back in at least 3/4 of patients quite quickly. So it used to be kind of 6 to 8 weeks after the first presentation. So it's not like it's spread at a later date. It was probably always there, but it just took a bit more time to kind of grow up. So I don't know if there'll be any children that we can get away with no treatment, but it may be that some children we can just give a very little bit of treatment and it just melts away super quick. Whereas there are others where it's a little bit better adapted, like the camels, where we maybe need to give a slightly stronger treatment.
Thank you. So got a question relating to the survival curves that you showed near the beginning. The 2006-2009 line continues to drop after the 5-year mark. It was my understanding that 5 years was seen as cured. Is that just that the relapse chance dropped significantly at that point?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's always difficult to make generalizations. So we do usually say 5 years is considered cured. Some people say 5 years from the end of treatment. Some people say 5 years from diagnosis. So that line was 5 years from diagnosis. So if you went out another 2 or 3 years, you'd see it has really become very, very flat. There are some children who do relapse beyond the 5 years from diagnosis point, but it becomes really, really rare. And so rare that, you can kind of, obviously if it happens to be you and your child, then it's devastating. But it's actually become so rare that, it's just as likely that something else might happen. We can all walk out of clinic and walk under a bus or whatever, so it becomes at this level where it's super rare. Also, we sometimes find with these ones that happen later, actually, they're not even this leukemia coming back. They're actually a second leukemia or a second problem. So that curve I was showing was overall survival. So that's survival from all causes. So actually, obviously, sadly, some children do die of other things. They might have a road traffic accident, or they might have, some meningitis or something like that, and that will show on those survival curves too. That's probably why you notice that small wobble. But the 5-year mark is a reasonable mark for saying that children are as good as cured without a 100% guarantee.
So next question is there anything we can do to help minimize potential side effects of intrathecal methotrexate for our children post-treatment?
So at the moment, unfortunately, not really. We know there are some things that the medical team are aware of that can minimize the side effects, so that you don't want to be on any other medicines that might increase the levels of methotrexate in the fluid. We give the right amount. We don't want to have even higher levels. So that's why sometimes people, things like certain antibiotics can affect that. We know that certain anesthetic agents might increase the chance of having a methotrexate side effect. These are what we call drug interactions, but the medical team are very aware of those, and we have lots of guidelines about how to minimize that. We also know that it's quite good to have good vitamin B12 levels to prevent some of these side effects. But again, the medical team know that. So unfortunately, as parents, there's not much that can be done at the moment, but we're hoping that our research will unlock things that we can do in the future.
Okay. So just to say, we have got about 30 questions. I'm not sure if we're going to manage all of them tonight. Is it okay, Chris, if any we don't get to, I put in an email and then I can sort of send out the answers if...
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be more than happy with that. That's fine.
Thank you. Rather than making you sit here answering every single one till midnight. Okay, so the next one is, are the children with executive function / ADHD issues more likely to have seizures than those that sail through treatment?
What a fantastic question. So I've always been fascinated in that. Does things that happen during treatment influence how you're going to do long term? There's been some studies from America that suggest that may be the case, but it's not a direct thing. So in general, kids who've had problems during treatment were slightly more affected long term than the kids hadn't, but it wasn't a one-to-one thing. So you could have a problem during treatment and not have a problem long term, but it was a bit more likely that you would have long-term problems. And I often think of the kids that have the problems during treatment as almost like the tip of the iceberg. So you're seeing the thing that's going above the surface. There's quite a lot of kids that don't have those seizures during treatment, but there's still something going on under the surface. And we do know if you do scans and brain scans during treatment, you have quite a lot of kids that seem fine, but actually on their brain scan, you can see early signs of problems, although sometimes that can revert back to normal again by the end of treatment. So it's really quite complicated. That's why we're hoping that this computer game might be a better way of getting in and seeing whether kids are having these early changes that aren't showing like things like as dramatic as fits or seizures.
So shifting over to a relevant question is, will that test that you are doing as part of your research, will that be opened up to kids in the UK, or is it only kids on specific studies?
Sorry, only kids on the altogether study. Is that right? What I missed the last bit? Yes. So I mentioned right at the end, we're developing some international guidelines for monitoring of brain side effects of chemo. They will hopefully come out quite soon. We've certainly been hoping that they would come out in 2024. I can't guarantee it. And they will really identify the children that should get that kind of testing, even if they haven't got symptoms. It goes back to what I ended on saying is that we don't have specific treatments for this. So really we look at treating children with things that help them if they're having difficulties. So you could say, if you're not having difficulties, why would you test? Because then you haven't, how's it going to help you? So at the moment, that testing and those treatments, that testing is really confined to children having difficulties to help them find solutions. We only really do the testing for children who aren't having difficulties in part of a research study, because obviously that will then allow us to look at antidotes and things in the future.
Okay, so I think a slight addition to that one is, would you advocate for all children having neuropsychology testing? I think about that a bit, but...
So similar to what I just said, but I would say I advocate all children having access to neuropsychology testing if they require it. But I don't think it's particularly helpful to test lots of children who aren't having problems and kind of say, ooh, you're just below average on this or just above average on that, if it's not actually impacting on how you're doing, because I think that can sometimes be quite demotivating, if you're told you've got problems when actually it's not causing a problem in your everyday life. You can almost make it a problem, if you like. So I think it should really be based on children's symptoms.
Okay. So another question, if that's okay. Are you okay to go up to 8?
Yes, that's fine by me.
So this person says, I'd be interested to know if there's a link between autism and chemotherapy. My daughter was diagnosed with autism. Can this be linked to spinal chemo?
Again, a really interesting question. We've never made a link between chemotherapy causing autism. Interestingly, some small studies, and this is not definite, but some small studies who've looked at children who are going to have problems with learning, memory, and things after treatment have found that genes that are associated with autism are also associated with these problems. And one of the problems with autism is the autistic spectrum disorders are relatively common, And because the peak age for leukemia diagnosis is age 2 to 5, that's also the same kind of age or just after that age you might be diagnosed with autism. So it's very difficult to see the chicken and egg, the cause and effect. It may be that the child, even without the leukemia treatment, would have developed autism, but they just weren't diagnosed because they were too little and that hadn't shown itself. Or it may be that the treatment had an impact on that. So we really don't understand the chicken and egg situation there, but I would say there's no good evidence that autism is caused by leukemia treatment.
Okay, so next question is, how much is down to treatment? This lady has identical twins. One has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So she says, if you're right in thinking that if only the child with leukemia has the difficulties and his identical twin brother doesn't, then difficulties must be down to treatment. Or can that happen naturally, that one twin has ADHD/autism?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I've really thought about that in detail, so I'm going to make sure I give the right kind of answer. So I would say with identical twins, that probably is quite a good marker of, what's due to the fact they had leukemia and what's not. But you need to remember it might not just be the chemo. So when you have leukemia, you spend a lot of time in hospital. Obviously, there's a lot of stress and anxiety, and you may be treated differently from your identical twin. And there's lots of other what we call environmental things that will be different because you are unlucky enough to develop leukemia that might not all be in your genes or related to the chemo itself, but obviously are related to the fact you needed treatment for leukemia. So I think it's quite a difficult thing to disentangle, but I would say that it would be quite, if you had enough identical twins of which one had leukemia treatment, one hadn't, it would be quite a powerful way of trying to work out. When I said, oh, the problem is it might be coincidence anyway, it would be quite good to look at those types of things. The trouble is you probably wouldn't have enough numbers to look at that scientifically, but it certainly is a very interesting situation.
So next question is, we've got a couple about whether or how long you could expect the cognitive challenges to last for, or whether you could expect them to improve a certain amount of time after treatment.
Yeah, again, a really interesting question. So I would say it's really variable. So probably there certainly are children who can have problems and challenges during therapy and shortly after therapy that then completely catch up. And that again may be due to some of those other things like missing school or stress and family, anxiety issues, etc., that can resolve. There probably are some other patients that or children who are cured who carry on having problems, and it is possible that you might have some where the problems get worse over time. We don't think that generally happens throughout your young adult life, but one of the things that we do think could happen in some people, and we don't have really good evidence for this, but one possibility is that you might get a bit of accelerated aging in the CNS. So your brain might be a little bit older than you are, if you like, so that we know if people live long enough, they will always have problems with memory and things. As people get to be very elderly, if you get into your 90s and 100s, you will inevitably have some problems with memory. And it may be that kids who've had childhood leukemia treatment, that could happen a little bit earlier. The reason I keep saying could, maybe, don't know, there actually aren't that many children, because leukemia was pretty fatal until the 1960s. We don't actually have many children who've been cured of leukemia who are in their 70s now. So it may be that over the next 10 to 15 years, it will become clear whether having been cured of childhood leukemia when you were really little, like age 2 or 3 or 4, whether that does or doesn't lead to some longer term problems as you age. But what we do know is we've got plenty of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, and as I mentioned, some of those are really holding down stellar jobs and doing really well. So it's definitely not inevitable that you will have progressive problems over time, and certainly there are many people who sail through treatment without problems.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions saying that we're asking if a child has like a pre-existing diagnosis or learning disability, or autism before their diagnosis, are they more susceptible to further damage than children without pre-existing conditions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too. So we know that children with Down syndrome are more likely to get leukemia, and they are also more likely to have what we call acute side effects of treatment, so things like fits on treatment. And we actually give anti-seizure, anti-epilepsy medicine to those kids during treatment to try and stop that in some situations where we know we're giving particularly risky medicines. So possibly, probably, but I think, again, it's really difficult to know for these other neurodevelopmental problems because you can't see into the future. When a child's diagnosed, you don't really know what they would be like 10 years down the line. So it's really difficult to know what was the leukemia and what might have happened anyway. So we just don't have the knowledge of that. But for Down syndrome, we're pretty sure that they are a little bit more susceptible, and we take special precautions because of that.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is, when we are given a risk grade on diagnosis, we're not told about the risk of relapse. As parents, we don't ask this in the initial months. Do you think in the future we'll know the relapse risks early on in the treatment?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult. My heart goes out to everyone who's had to go through that diagnosis conversation, and the amount of information you're given, and it's just overwhelming. I think we don't give information about the risk of relapse in the brain, mainly because the treatment covers that, and the risk is really very small. So the problem isn't so much with brain leukemia that you're at really high risk of relapse. It's that we don't really know how much treatment to give each patient accurately. So what we give does its job really well, but it might cause side effects, which obviously we prefer to avoid. I do think in the future, I think in the amount of information we give to parents is improving all the time. I think the ways we deliver, I think we have much more focus on how we deliver that information. So I think there's a lot of efforts. They're not quite through yet, but there's a lot of talking about making sure that we deliver it in understandable ways, maybe videos, maybe things you can come back to, because as I say, that first chat, there's so much information that's given. It's really hard to take that all in. We've now gone to what's called a standardized consent form, which actually goes through all the risks of chemo, and the parents and families are given that to take away so that they've got something to refer to. So even if they don't remember something being mentioned, they can go back and say, oh yeah, that was mentioned. But of course, with all of these things, we're always battling the fact that we've got a child with a life-threatening condition and we need to treat them, and the most important thing is to get the leukemia into remission. So there's always a balance between kind of saying what's bad about the treatment, but the fact is the treatment's necessary and saves the vast majority of children's lives. So there's always balance.
So I've got a little bit of a more complicated one, I think. Got somebody whose child went through treatment, which was successful, but after the bell has been ringing the bell has been very difficult because they've got pretty much every side effect you've mentioned, but is getting pushed around a lot by medical teams. Do you have any advice for people in that sort of situation of how to get help?
Yeah, it's really tough. I really feel for that family. That is always a problem. I think I said at the end of my talk, oh, I'm not a brain specialist, so I might not be able to. We do now, the way medicine's practiced is that we do rely on specialists in different areas. So if your child has lots and lots of side effects, they end up often seeing many different specialists, which is lots of medical appointments, and maybe you may feel that one doctor doesn't speak to another doctor or doesn't know what's going on, and that kind of coordination of the care is really important. Most of the principal treatment centres, the hubs that treat childhood cancer, do have a kind of multidisciplinary team responsible for late and after effects of treatment, who should be able to pull that together. So I think it goes back to really talking to your medical team, expressing the fact that you're finding this really difficult, that you've got all these different things going on and there doesn't seem to be one person responsible, and trying to work with them about how you might have a kind of a coordinator of that kind of complex care.
Okay, so right, one moment, let me find it. So next question is about the survival curves again. So as you showed that the survival rates have increased greatly over the years, have you noticed a rise recently in relapsed children with leukemia?
I'm sorry, I missed, Ellie, the beginning of that question.
Oh.
I can't see it. I can't see it on the thing. So say again.
Oh, this one came through the chat. So it was, as you have shown the survival rates have increased greatly over the years, have you noticed a rise recently in relapsed children with leukemia?
No, we haven't. So, I mean, the relapse is continuing to go down over time.
Okay, me trying to find the most impactful questions, but they're all, yeah, they're all very important. So it's quite hard to choose. So, is there a difference in the neurology outcomes if diagnosed at different ages, for example, 2 versus 6?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. We think that very young children are probably more vulnerable than older children. As you can imagine, their brain's like developing really, really fast. So any, that can be a problem if you put chemotherapy in there. That's particularly true for radiotherapy. So we try and avoid radiation treatment to children under the age of 2 if at all possible, because it can be associated with quite significant problems. Sometimes it's not possible if it's to save their life, but we do if we can. But actually, some of the what I call acute side effects, the side effects that happen on treatment, can actually be specific to different ages. So that we know that teenagers might have more of a thing that we call stroke-like syndrome than younger children, whereas younger children might be more likely to have the attention problems and the behavior problems with steroids. So there's different things for different ages, and that probably reflects underlying hormonal changes and other predispositions from different ages. So there's not a straight answer to that, but very young children, yes, probably are more susceptible, but otherwise it's a little bit bespoke according to the individual complication.
Great, so I think we're going to do 2 more questions if that's okay.
Sure.
So first one is, somebody would like to know if they're halfway through treatment, can they expect the side effects to get worse? Is there a cumulative effect of the exposure to chemotherapy?
So it's not kind of possibly, but not definitely is the answer. So there is a relationship between the amount of chemo you get and the likelihood of having brain side effects. But I go back to the same point I made again, that some people can have really strong chemo and have no problems at all. And then others can have relatively small amounts and have a lot of problems. So it's not really inevitable in any way, but it is certainly possible that things could worsen. Usually, if you compare the end of treatment with a couple of years after the end of treatment, if anything, you see a slight improvement. So some people may get completely back to normal, others may kind of plateau, but there is usually a kind of recovery phase. So I wouldn't be completely doom and gloom about that.
It's good to have a slight positive. So I think we're going to end on this question because it's also somewhat positive. How far away are you from testing the cough medicine idea in the clinical trials?
Yeah, excellent question. I would say we are a little way off, and the reason for that is, although it's such an attractive concept, and I was blown over when I first read those studies that were done in the lab, actually blocking that receptor could potentially have some effects on other drugs that we give for leukemia, not the methotrexate, which it doesn't block, but other things. So we would have to work out a safe dose. We need to work out how long to give it for. Do we just give it during the methotrexate, or do we give it permanently? The body can get used to drugs and then they stop working so well and all these kind of things. So there's an awful lot of that kind of safety stuff to get there first. There are some other medicines that are starting to go into very early trials in America for trying to prevent some brain effects. And one of those is a common diabetes drug called metformin, which seems to reduce the kind of some of the stress on the brain when the leukemia cells are killed in the brain. And that has some pretty promising results as well. So we may not be that far off for some trials for some things, but the cough mixture one, we're probably a little bit further than some of the other treatments suggested.
Fair enough. I mean, do you want to make sure that whatever you're going to do is actually definitely going to be a benefit? Yeah. So I've just put in the chat to say thank you to everyone for your questions. And like I got with Chris, I will get back to you with any answers I can provide as soon as possible. I also just wanted to add, aside from my normal script, that CCLG do have a parent and carers group on Facebook, which I'll put the link to in the email. So I've seen a few people saying it's nice to talk to other parents. So I'll drop that in because it's quite a nice supportive environment. A lot of people ask questions and connect with other families. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you very much to Chris for your talk and many answers. This talk has been recorded and we'll be sending it out in the next few days if you'd like to share it or watch it again. You'll also be receiving an email shortly asking for your feedback on today's talk. This is so we can make sure the talks are the best they can be. So please do take a couple of minutes to let us know what you thought. And I will let everyone go. Thank you very much for attending, and yes, have a lovely evening.
Bye from me too. Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks for all your support.
Thank you.